You're listening to Resolution Radio, where the details say it all. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Chris Dumpleton, and today I'm here with history buff Ken Acker to discuss the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. As you may recall, the incident happened in April of 1986 and still haunts Ukraine to this very day. What happened that night was so catastrophic that it is widely considered the worst man-made disaster in history. And today we'll be digging into the details of not only what happened then, what's happening there now. Alright, let's welcome Ken.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm Ken Acker, and I've spent much of my time researching the events of Chernobyl and exactly what took place in that seemingly quiet night. You might be surprised, but what actually introduced me to Chernobyl in the first place was a video game Call of Duty 4, and ever since I've been fascinated with the topic.
That's quite interesting. Well, I have a few questions for you, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about what happened that night. We know that Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant in the USSR, and up until 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, it was operating rather normally.
It was.
So what happened that night?
Well, first I have to say that particular night in question may have seemed ordinary from the outside of the power plant. But inside reactor number 4, around midnight, employees were actually running a rather routine test. It wasn't supposed to be a dangerous test. It was supposed to be a pretty rudimental safety drill, and was simply meant to simulate a power failure in the case of a blackout, where the safety systems would be intentionally shut down. But the test didn't quite go as planned.
So what happened that night?
You see, the test could have and should have gone properly, but that night, the shift leader, Alexander Akimov, was outranked by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, a man who ultimately may be responsible for the entire tragedy if it hadn't been for the physical design flaws in the reactor.
How was Anatoly Dyatlov responsible for the terrible disaster?
Well, Dyatlov decided to run the safety test in a way that did not follow the guidelines, and he demanded that the employees begin a test at a power level that was much lower than recommended. They resisted, but ultimately they feared losing their jobs in opposition to such a revered man in the industry.
That's crazy. Why would such a high-ranking man run a test the wrong way?
In Dyatlov's mind, there was little risk in reducing the recommended power of at least 700 megawatts to 200 megawatts. He thought that he would be able to preserve the water meant to cool the reactor from overheating. I think that he really thought he was going to make more of a name for himself as a pioneer by conducting the test as he did. He deliberately didn't follow procedure.
I think we all know what happens when you don't follow the rules.
Yeah, consequences.
Well, we have one more question before the break. Here goes. Because the test wasn't done correctly, what was it that truly caused Chernobyl to make history that night?
The power dropped too quickly, the water level became uncontrollably low, and ultimately the reactor stalled. But they continued on with the test because Dyatlov was a rather stubborn guy. It was around this time, a little before 1 a.m., that he made the fateful decision that ended in such an incredible catastrophe.
That's unbelievable. This sounds like a science fiction novel.
It's the truth. It happened.
Well, we have to take a commercial break, but we'll be right back after these messages. Stay tuned for the conclusion of recounting the events of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And we're back with Resolution Radio. I'm Chris Templeton, and currently, historian Ken Acker and I are discussing the events that took place at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the night of the worst man-made disaster in history. If you just tuned in with us, we've already discussed the events leading up to the accident, including Deputy Chief Anatoly Dyatlov deliberately running a standard safety test wrong in reactor number 4. He began the test on the reactor 500 megawatts less than the guidelines called for, causing the reactor to stall and the water levels to become so low that they were hard to control.
Also, I thought I'd mention that these safety tests were designed to prepare employees for a terrorist attack, and they were first demanded by Russia's atomic energy authorities during the Cold War.
I see. They wanted to test what would happen if they lost power in an emergency situation.
Right.
Well, I'm going back to the questions. Is that all right, Ken?
Absolutely.
Here we go. So the test began at a power level much lower than it was supposed to start with, causing the reactor's water level to get dangerously low and the reactor to stall. What happened next?
So Dyatlov was upset that the reactor stalled, and he now wanted the crew to power up the reactor immediately. But everything wasn't as it seemed because there was a design flaw that made the reactor dangerously unstable at low power. So to raise power, the crew had to pull all the control rods out of the reactor's core. Former employees have said that this was like cocking a gun.
And what do the control rods do?
Well, the control rods serve as the accelerators and the brakes in turning water into steam, thus creating energy. The steam then moves through a giant turbine to convert the energy into electricity. In this case, there were 1,661 control rods under the 50-foot lid of reactor number 4. The rods, being made of uranium and boron, were removed to restore power, creating the opportunity for pressure to build. This is what caused the crew to lose control of the amount of pressure in the reactor's core. They didn't know the pressure was building up so greatly, and as unaware of the danger as they were, they ultimately decided to resume the safety drill under the orders of Dyatlov. Many members of the crew knew what they were doing was very risky, but again, they feared losing their job, so they proceeded with the drill. This is ultimately what caused the explosion, releasing an array of radioactive substances into the atmosphere.
The reactor exploded?
Yes, the 350-kilo control rod caps were literally popping out of their sockets.
Yikes, I'm sure that was a sight to see. I have only a few more questions before we have to go. How did the explosion change the lives of those who lived and worked there?
Well, for starters, other than death and radiation poisoning, people who lived in the nearby town of Pripyat, a town constructed for the employees of the plant and their families, were quickly evacuated and left their entire lives behind. The town still sits empty today and is a haunting reminder of what happened that night. The radiation levels are so high that even now the town is unlivable. There are rampant deformities in the flora and fauna in the surrounding areas. The Chernobyl exclusion zone is a fascinating tourist attraction, what with Reactor 4 encased in a giant sarcophagus now, but those who visit it can only do so briefly because it's still a dangerous place and likely will be for thousands of years.
And finally, what can we learn from the disaster at Chernobyl?
I think that we can learn a lot, whether in regard to following safety procedures, having a plan when disaster strikes, standing up for what's right, or simply being extra careful when working with radioactive materials. At times like this, I think of that Robert Frost quote. In 3 words, I can sum up everything about life. It goes on. And even in the catastrophic case of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, there's a beginning after an ending, where we know more than we did before, and we can slowly rebuild.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ken, for joining us today to revisit the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. I'm Chris Templeton, and you've been listening to Resolution Radio, where the details say it all. Have a fantastic evening.